Hello, Sharon.
Hi, Sheila.
Welcome to this. It's really lovely of you to give your time. We're going to be in conversation for Systemic Lives, which is involved. It's part of Everything is Connected Press, of which Murmurations, which is the journal of transformative systemic practice, is also a part of. And it's my absolute pleasure to be to have this opportunity to kind of really get a bit of an idea for our audience about who you are. Because a lot of people will know you, definitely in the um, in the UK context, because you've been around for a very long time,
Yeah.
part of the fabric of systemic community, and much loved by people. Uh, so, and I'm hoping that we kind of go backwards to come forwards into the present, to kind of have an idea about your various journeys that have kind of contributed to getting you here, um, into systemic thinking and practice.
Hey, well, thank you. And thank you for choosing me, you Murmurations. Um, yeah, I'm kind of, I'm kind of excited, but I'm kind of also wondering where this will go.
A bit of the unknown, which we're very
Definitely.
used to, right? Dealing with the unknown and sort of the unfamiliar. Um, some kind of relational risk taking, maybe for both you and I.
Mm.
And well, interesting you say where it's going to go. And I guess I'm sort of wondering if we can start a little bit into the very beginnings of Sharon Bond, and wanting to find out first of all where you were born and the family into which you were born.
Okay, I was born in Guyana, which is in South America. Um, in the same year that the NHS was founded, although I knew nothing about that until I came here. So I always think it's a special year um, because of what was happening politically. And my dad moved to England in 1951, closely followed by my mother, and then myself and my sister, and then my other brother and sister. And my youngest sister was actually born here in 1953. So by then, the whole family was in England.
So how many years were you actually in Guyana before you came to England?
I was 8
Eight
when
years
I
old.
left. Yes.
Interesting. I was also 8 years old when I came to this country in 1973.
Oh,
So I'm wondering, what do you remember about your time in Guyana? What would you have carried with you into your
gosh.
journey into UK?
What I remember, I lived with my grandmother, um, and I just remember it being fun. We're having lots of space and time. We lived close to the sea, so we could just walk up to the seawall. So it's for me, it was a childhood that was quite carefree. Um, yeah,
Mhm.
quite carefree.
So sort of quite pleasant kind of memories, fun
Yeah.
memories of your time there. And then I wonder, and you were talking about your grandmother as well, and are there any kind of stories from her that you might have kind of come with into UK?
Um, I don't know really. I mean, if I think back, I think my grandmother was an entrepreneur herself. She sold fish. As I said, we lived close to the sea, so my uncles were involved in catching fish. She would catch them, she would take them, she would sell them. So she was a very busy lady.
Mm-hmm.
So our experience was her actually working and as well as taking care of us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and neighbors were where we lived. You knew your neighbors, and everyone looked out for everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
So we couldn't get away with anything because they'd tell her if we did anything we weren't supposed to. So it was that kind of upbringing for me.
Mm-hmm. That carefree sort of opportunity to kind of do things that you wanted to. I mean, living by the sea just sounds really wonderful. And
Yeah,
I was wondering what that was like then to leave that behind and come to UK. And where did you come to? Which city did you come into?
yeah, that was. I think we were excited about coming to be with mum and dad. So for a long time, it was like, yeah, sad to go, but
Mm-hmm.
here we are. And we came to, like, my parents had bought a house in London because, in Hackney, in fact, because at that time, it wasn't easy to rent if you were black.
Right.
Um,
There would have been that notice, right? That.
there were all the signs around, no coloureds,
Mhm.
no gypsies, no Irish, no dogs, no children, no anything. So my parents bought a house in Stoke Newington, and that's where I grew up.
A very, very different kind of environment that you came into. And so I'm wondering what those early memories might have been like. Was there anything that was particularly that stands out for you that kind of had some kind of influence? You were talking about that particular kind of period that you came into where there was very different kind of race relations. Um, but I'm just
Hmm.
wondering also about Stoke Newington and, you coming to be with your parents and your siblings all together. What was that like for you? What was your early memories of your times together in your family?
Yeah, well, there weren't many black people, obviously. So the school I went to, unlike now, I think my sister and I were the only black children in the school. So you that was how it was. Um, but I enjoyed school. There were problems, but mostly I enjoyed school. And at that time there was 11 plus.
Mhm.
I mean, there were subtle things that I didn't know about as a child or understand. So when I came from Guyana, I could write my name and I could do joined up writing.
Mm.
And that seemed to be a surprise to people in the school that I could do that. Um, and I remember we had 11 plus, and they called my parents up and they said, "Oh, she's just failed the 11 plus, so she can't go to grammar school, but she can go to this school." So they sent me to a secondary school, and they said, "And if after 2 years she's doing well, then she can go to the grammar school." Of course, I was doing well after 2 years. I was coming top in class. I was doing well in English. I was doing well in everything. But I didn't want to leave my school either.
Mhm.
Why would I want to leave and go to another school? So I stayed there. I had friends there. And I think it was, our school had a policy. Prize days were where the families came and, you got to show off, and the prize day was always held at the town hall. And you were only allowed to have two prizes. And I remember I must have been about 15 or so, and I got the French prize, I got the English prize, I got the music prize, and I could only have two.
Mm-hmm.
And they said to me, you can have the music prize and you can have the English prize. And I said, I don't want the music prize. My parents paid for me to go and learn music because I was doing piano lessons and all that. And so music wasn't anything accomplished or anything my parents didn't know about. I want the French prize. And they said, well, if you have the French prize, then there was another girl there who, if she had the French prize, would have had two prizes. But if I took the French prize, she would only get one, and the one would go to someone else. I don't know who. And I said, well, I've earned this. I've come top in French. I want the French prize, and I want my parents to see me getting the French prize. And I was told I had to go and see the French teacher and tell him that. So I went to the French teacher and I said, I want to go up and receive the French prize. And he said to me, you have to go and see the deputy head and tell her that. So I said, okay, I went to the deputy head and I said, I want the French prize. I want to go up and receive the French prize. And she said, well, it doesn't really matter which prize you receive because it'll be the same thing. And I said, that might be so, but I want my parents to see me get the French prize, not the music prize. I got the French prize. However, I wasn't the most popular person.
Amongst the teachers.
But I guess why I tell that story is that it connects me with later on in my life. And I remember, I didn't at the time, but afterwards, when I was thinking about some of the things that have happened and what I've had to stand up for, I thought to myself, well, you shouldn't be surprised. You've been doing that before.
Mm-hmm.
So
So
maybe I was bullshit. I don't know.
very bolshy and feisty, to stand up to kind of the authority, in school, who had a very different idea about what you should be choosing. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering, where did you get that courage or that bolshiness from? Where did it come from?
I think it can only be from my parents. If I'm going to blame anyone, I'll be them. I think
Tell
it
us
can
a
only
little
be
bit
from them.
about your parents, and because for a 15-year-old in that kind of context, at that time, for you to kind of stand up for yourself in the way you did, uh, had to take quite a lot of confidence and grit. And I'm wondering what
Hmm.
contributions you think your parents made.
I don't think I thought of it as that at the time. When I tell the story, other people put that on, but my parents they just thought we could do things. They did things. My dad would, in the summer, he'd drive us around to different parts of England. And I remember us going to Hyde Park. Um, and of course, we stood out. Hyde Park was very different then. It was, you could drive in, you could have picnics. It was very open. And he drove us down to Hyde Park and we got our ice cream can and we were sitting around and we were playing cricket and stuff like that because my dad loved cricket. Um, and people were walking past and wondering what's going on here? Who are they? And if they came over and talked to us, we'd talk to them, my dad. But basically, my mum and dad were, well, just be yourself, be who you were. They didn't preach to us, they didn't do anything of that. They just showed us how to be yourself. And I think that's the lesson I took from them.
Mhm, mhm.
Had to be yourself.
So that's been a real kind of solid kind of anchoring for you. Something about what they conveyed about their kind of strength as well, that it must have taken for them to come into a context where they were maybe as a family, you were talking about being the only one, you know, being in that area of London, Stoke Newington, and then in a school where you were, one of two, and then in
Mm.
Hyde Park, really standing out in some ways. So something about sort of being in those more dominant kind of white spaces in that particular era, and the kind of a courage that it must have taken. And is that something that you shared with your siblings as well? Or were they sort of equally kind of feisty and bolshy as you were, or?
I think I was probably the bolshiest of the five of us. Um, I think my parents were very Guyanese in their outlook. So they brought a bit of Guyana with them. And we did have friends around us who were Guyanese, their friends, um, living in different parts of Hackney. So we kind of get together, or they get together. And there were some traditions like Christmas, you all get together and so on. So um, it was just, as I say, being who we were.
Mhm,
Wasn't Yes, you fitted in, but you fitted in bringing who you were rather than ignoring or trying to hide who you were.
mhm. And you were talking about that sort of the Guyanese kind of culture, and there may be lots of other things that your parents brought in terms of values, or sort of, things that they felt were important. How did you navigate that kind of switching context from going into predominantly kind of white spaces like school and with friends, and then also being at home with your parents,
Hmm.
kind of in a different culture? How did you manage?
It's it's hard to answer because I don't remember doing anything at all. I'd go to school, get on with it. I'd come home. As I said, I did well in school, so my parents were always very supportive. They'd come up to open days, to whatever, to talk with my teachers about me. They were just always there and very supportive. Um, I think it was only when I left school and then went into the bigger world of work, and then I realized, I think I said to someone, I've slept walked all through my life. I don't feel like I was navigating. I think maybe I felt like I was in a dream and just doing all the things I was supposed to do, to get on with life. It just felt like I slept walks through my life. So I don't, like some people have things that stand out.
Mhm,
Those couple of things I told you were things that stood out for me, but in general, I mean, little fights. I can remember Janet Gower, who picked on me at school with all her friends. I still remember her name and her talons and everything. And I don't know why she was picking on me, but I just thought, well, don't come and pick on me. Go and pick on someone else.
mhm.
Um,
Is that
so,
another sort of place where you stood up for yourself, do you think?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you just managed
Mhm, mhm.
things.
I mean, it's interesting you're using that expression about sleepwalking, but it sounds like there was also a part of you which was very kind of focused and clear, and just kind of went through with things, and kind of, whatever you had to kind of deal with, whether it was school or then work, you've started to mention work, you kind of just got on with it.
Yeah.
Um, and so it sounds like there was some real agency there as well. And so I'm wondering
Mm.
about that sort of, if we're just thinking a little bit about you still being that young adult, I'm wondering what kind of things do you remember from that sort of young adulthood time that might have also had an influence in terms of things like songs or culture, or books that you might have read, or what you were talking about, your experience of work? Is there anything that kind of really stands out as things that have kind of influenced you or that have kind of stayed with you?
I used to read a lot. I read just about everything. I didn't know what I wanted to read, so I got really interested in the Regency period when I was maybe 14, 15. But wherever you saw me, I'd have a book. I'd sit down and eat, and the book would be there. I always had a book. But I think when I was probably about 17, because I was in and out of libraries, I went into the library at Shoreditch and I saw a bell hooks book, Entire Woman. And I got that book and I read it. And I thought I connected with that book. In fact, it never got back to the library. I kept it. And I've still got it upstairs.
What's the symbol?
Oh, so yeah. And that was when I started reading much more about books that represented me. And so I I do remember I'd read Soledad Brothers, Malcolm X. Um, I'd read loads of books about that. Of course, they were mostly American,
Mhm,
but I think the beginnings of the Black Power movement it started in America and was coming over here. So I'd go to the rallies and stuff like that, and learned a bit more. And I remember I was a personal secretary because I did shorthand and typing at school. And I was a personal secretary in the post office. And I remember I had my little office, and the executive officers and some of the people would come in and bring their work to be typed. And I thought, this is me. I was really kind of like, this is me. So I had my picture of Jonathan, I can't remember his name, from one of the Soledad, his brother, Jonathan Jackson, his brother George Jackson had been imprisoned at 15, and they had just they just kept him in there. And there was Jonathan, who was dressed like Che Guevara with his bullets and stuff like that across his chest. Had a full-size picture of him on my wall in the office. And I thought, anyone come in here? This is me. Don't mess. And it was interesting because some of the people would come in and bring me their work. And I didn't realize at first that they were a bit afraid of me.
mhm, mhm.
And then one of the EO came in and he started to talk to me and we talk. And that's how I learned that they were a bit afraid of me, because he'd come in and he'd talk with me. And we had these conversations. I must have been about, I don't know, 21-ish. I was
So
quite young. And, when you're young, it's like you can do anything in the world. And I think I was a bit like that.
really out there and very, very kind of transparent about
Yeah.
what were your kind of idols, and who you were sort of wanting to represent.
Yes.
But what is it, do you think, you you kind of exuded that people were afraid of at that young age? What
I
was
had,
your understanding about that?
I didn't understand it. I had no idea. Um, I didn't see myself as frightening or anything. I mean, I was into fashion. I was very fashionable, would always dress. That was so, those were the two things about me. So I don't know what people were afraid of. It was a surprise to me because I used to talk to everyone. Because there was this older guy, he didn't work there. I can't remember what he did, but he used to love to come in and talk about what it was like um, in the very early 30s and 20s. And we used to have fascinating conversations where he'd tell me about what his life was like. So I didn't have an idea of me being this fearsome person, but it may be that, the communication there was much more what people connected with than me.
Yeah, sort of something about them not fully knowing you, but something about sort of the image of you. Um,
Yeah.
but again, a sort of very interesting. You were talking about how you really were almost seeking out, you said, people and writings, your love of reading, sort of people who were more representing you. And you spoke about bell hooks. And of course, she's an inspiration for many people and has been. And I wondered what she spoke to you, of um, as you were a young adult and sort of listening to another Black woman, even though someone from the
Mm.
other, across the continent. What was it about what she was writing that really appealed to you?
I think it might have been about the invisibility because right around about then or somewhere it's muddled in my head. There was talk about feminism and women's rights and all of those things. That was also an emerging story alongside stories of blackness and black power and so on. And there was somehow I didn't feel that story fitted with me. And reading her helped me to understand why it didn't fit with me. Hence her question, ain't I a woman too? Um, so yeah, she made me curious and made me begin to look at and think about that invisibility
Mhm.
that I was invited into.
So
And
very profound, sort of preoccupations for someone in their 20s. You're talking about how you're really contesting in some ways that even feminism at that time, who were, you know, advocating for sort of the kind of oppression of patriarchy, that they somehow in that process they made Black women invisible, that somehow they weren't taking the kind of experience of Black women into account. And so yeah, again sort of really struck by how you were questioning, a bit like that 15-year-old who was like questioning, okay, I'm not going to take the music prize, that isn't me, you know this is me, it's the French prize. And sort of again here you're talking about this theme of the invisibility or the lack of representation of who you were from what was around you, and you started to seek out particular people who seemed to be speaking more to you
mm,
of sort of who you were and what your experiences were. And I wonder how that kind of, during that time as you were working, what were other influences for you in sort of in that sort of maybe quest or sort of that preoccupation about trying to kind of look out for, I don't, almost sort of experiences that were centering you and sort of made it more possible for you to be visible.
It's interesting because as I listen to you, that sounds so coherent. But I always think there was nothing coherent about my life. Looking back, you can put it together and get a coherence, and you've done that beautifully. But me living it, I didn't experience it in that coherent way. It was just this, that, that. I landed here, I landed there. So that was how it felt to me. And I think I learned little bit by little bit because I had a friend who had said to me, because I'd left school without A levels. I had an O level, but no A levels. And I thought I'd go over to France and work and so on. And I talked with my French teacher and he'd arranged for a family to go with. And then I thought, I don't want to leave home. So I didn't. And so I started working. My friend said to me, um, why don't you go back to college and do your A level? She says, I'm doing sociology and I'm doing da da da. And I said, I was working at the time and I went to my bosses, two women, and I said, I'd like to do this. I'd like to go to day release. And they said, yeah. And they said, not only yes, go, they said, we'll give you so much in terms of book vouchers for you to buy books that you might need. And so I enrolled at Tottenham College, where they were doing sociology and economic history, which were the two I chose. And off I went. And I had these two women bosses who were really nice. And they were really like, yeah, you take the time off, you do it, you go ahead. And when I got through, I really enjoyed doing it. And my sociology teacher said to me, you know, you can go back and do a degree as a mature student. And I thought, and he said, I'll write you a reference. And I left it and left it. And then I eventually applied to one place. And I went along for the interview. And they said, it was late. They said, well, um, we're not sure. You've only got one A level. And if we didn't offer you a place, would you come back and try again next year? And I said to them, said to the interviewer, no, I won't do that. I said, next year I'll apply to the LSE. Because I'd started doing another A level at one of the colleges. So I said to her, no, I won't do that. I'm going to apply to LSE next year. And then I got the invitation to do my sociology degree there.
So
So,
that bulginess had a really good effect
yeah.
on your enduring friend.
And I actually had intended to do that because I'd looked at their prospectus and I thought, because the one at North London was theoretical, it didn't equip you for anything. It was just sociology and ethics and psychology and stuff like that. And I'd looked at the one at LSE and that was similar. And there were other places that were doing it, but they were doing it in a way that equipped. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I want to do something I'll enjoy and something I want to do. So I got the place at North London to read sociology. And so I started, I didn't take myself seriously. And my very first essay, one of my lecturers looked at it and he said, there's only 2 lines of this that makes any sense. The rest of it is just fluff and nonsense and so on. And I thought, I was very hurt. And I thought, okay, I'll have to do better next time. So I put in a bit of work, not too much, but just a bit more work so that I did better. And I thought, okay, I can do that. So I really enjoyed my time at university. I don't think I worked terribly hard, didn't intend to, but I met lots of people and lots of friends, and it was fun.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it was finished, I thought, I don't really know what I want to do. I don't want to be a social worker, which is what everyone was saying I could do with it. And in the end, that's exactly what I did. I became a social worker.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The thing that you didn't want to do. I mean, it's really fascinating to hear you talk about the journey into social work, um, and sort of almost like you said, landing into it. You know, you're talking earlier about landing here, landing there, and yet at the same time, there's this sense that you're making choices, and I'm sort of wondering, you know, which year we're in now in the sort of when you started to do the social work training, and you know what's happening around you, who are you with, friends, family, who's there with
Mm.
this particular kind of period.
Okay, this would have been the end of the 70s when I started working as an education social worker. I hadn't qualified as a social worker then, but I got a job as an education social worker because I didn't really want to be a real social worker. So I thought if I do it in schools, I wouldn't be a real social worker. But because I didn't particularly like the thought of being a social worker, but I didn't mind doing education and so on. And that was actually the best thing for me because I got to talk to people. Part of it was about taking people to court if they didn't attend school. But the most part of it was about getting to talk with families and young people and supporting them and helping them and stuff like that. So it was something I enjoyed, and going into school and setting up I wasn't trained as a counsellor, but setting up some counselling in school and stuff like that. And then I think they actually funded my training as a social worker.
Mhm.
So off I went to Goldsmiths and did a year and became a social worker, a proper social
Proper.
worker, proper social worker. But while I was training, in my training, I chose to work in a residential home so I could see what it was like for those children living in that environment. And the other training I did was in what we now call a CAMS. It's called a Child and Family Consultation Service then. So I did my training there. And that's in part because when I was an education social worker, I'd send people to CAMS for help. And very often they didn't get there or they went and they complained. So I thought, let me go and see what that experience might be like. And I could see why they didn't come. And I don't know if you trained as a social worker.
No, I went through the psychology route and then trained in family therapy,
Okay.
but I was very
Well,
familiar with kind of that whole role of education social work, and then the early kind of child guidance, which then became child and family consultation services. But yeah, what were you seeing about that sort of experience that you think your families were not sort of feeling happy about?
Well, I think it was the way they got judged and blamed. And when I was in there, I remember I was in on my placement, and my supervisor on placement was training to be a psychotherapist, but she was doing psychodynamic psychotherapy. And so when I spoke to her about some of the people that came in and how I talked with them, she was furious with me. She said, when people come to see you, you don't talk with them until you get them into the room. You leave them with their own thoughts. But I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, this is unusual. You're very nervous. Let me talk with you and just get, can't walk down a corridor with you without saying a word, which is what she wanted. And I thought, oops. So what will I do now? Now I will do it, but I won't tell her I'm doing it. So I work with my clients and got on very well with my clients, but I only told my supervisor what she wanted to know.
So, but sort of doing this kind of work in your own way on the side, almost sort of like a secret thing that you could,
Yeah,
yes. It's interesting because one of the things I do remember from that sort of time is that there were a number of family therapists who were also in child guidance, and there were social workers. So I'm just wondering, when you had your encounter with family therapy, when did that come about?
that didn't come about for years. When I was in that clinic, there was a family therapy team, but I didn't understand what they were doing or what they're about. I went to a couple of meetings, didn't understand it, didn't touch me, didn't think it important. When I was working as a social worker and I kind of got promoted in education social work, and I became a deputy divisional manager. And one of my managers, even higher up, said to me, you might want to think about doing psychotherapy. She'd wanted to do it and she hadn't. She was Black and she hadn't. She said, you might want to do psychotherapy. I thought, what's psychotherapy? And if it means I'll be like that supervisor, I don't want to do it. But I thought, you know what? Go and try it. So I went to evening classes and tried it and knew that I didn't like it, because when I talked to people and tried to do what I was supposed to do, they only got angry with me. So I thought, this is obviously not for me. And then I saw an advert from KCC where I went to study, and it said, are systemic ideas for me? Had no idea what it meant or what systemic ideas were. So I went along, and it was Peter Lang talking about working with families systemically, and the penny dropped. And I knew that was what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
So
What was it, do you think, about the way Peter Lang was describing systemic work that really, really kind of connected for you then?
he told a story of the owl who was afraid of the dark, which is a book. And it was the way he told it and all the many voices that came in to help this owl make a decision. And somehow that connected with me. It wasn't about judging people, it was accepting where they are, walking with them, all of those things. And I thought, this is what I want to do. So I then went back to, there'd been all sorts of things going on at work where um, I was getting lots of complaints about me because they hadn't wanted me there in the first place. So there were lots of complaints coming in. And my manager understood that there were complaints and no foundation to them. However, she said to me, well, you know what? And I think people were saying to me, take them to race relations, do this, do that. And I thought, and my partner said to me, do you want to work in that industry? And I said, yes. He said, well, what do you think will happen if you do this? Is that the best thing for you to do? No. Okay, so we won't go down that route. But she did say to me, we will fund any training you want. And so when I found this systemic ideas, they were doing clinical practicum, where you could go during the day, work directly with the family supervised. And I said to my manager, I'd like to do that. And so she paid for me to do that. That was their way of recompensing me. I recognized that. I didn't mind. So I did the ClinPrac for a year. And I thought, this is definitely for me. And I thought I will go on and do the third and the fourth year. So they said, yes, I could. They'd give me a place. And then I thought, well, why don't I go to the TAVI? It's got the name. So I applied to the TAVI, got an interview, did it all. And you will know from the TAVI, they do about 3 interviews.
Yes.
You do the group one, and then you have 2 individual ones. So I did all of that. And then they called me back. And they said, well, we're not sure. We think this, and we need to interview you again. And they sent me a lot of stuff to read about the kind of literature I'd have to read in the third and fourth year. They sent that all to me. Okay. I thought, where do I start with this? So I just didn't read it because I didn't know what to read, what not to read. So I went for the interview, and I think one of the questions I was asked, I don't think the TAVI had any Black students then. In fact, I know they didn't. And one of the questions I was asked was, you'll probably be the only Black person in the group. How do you think you'd manage that? And I thought, and I looked at my interviewer and I said, this isn't a question you should be asking me, because that's been my entire experience living here and working here. You should be asking the white people in the class, how will they manage with me in the class? Okay.
Another example of standing up for yourself and bolshiness, feistiness, courage, whatever you want to call it. That is a very, very, very significant kind of, it may be even sort of like a challenging thing to say to them. And I'm just wondering what, again, sort of where did that courage come from for you
I
to
have
put it back to them?
I have no idea, because I hadn't intended to be bolshy or anything, but I thought to myself, well, where do you think I'm living? You're asking me a question that actually doesn't make sense. I realized I processed all of that very quickly and thought, this doesn't make sense. This is what you should do. Anyway, the interview went on and I was asked about the reading. And I said, well, you sent me all of that stuff. And if you really, really wanted to know what I could have done, you might have said, well, here are these papers. I want you to write an essay around this and show me how you'd use them. But as it was, I didn't know what to do with them. And I said, I'm now wondering whether you asked me here to dot the I's and cross the T. So when you say no, you've done that. needless to say, I didn't get offered a place.
You you definitely would have made them think, because even that, I'm wondering if there was any response or just total kind of silence and awkward silence. I mean, it's there's a part of me that's also connecting with some possible anger or unfairness that you might have felt in being treated in that way, because you're being asked to come back for a second interview when other people would have already had an interview
Mm,
probably once, and you were being given material which you would have been doing if you were going to go on the course, not beforehand.
mm,
So there's an expectation that you would be looking at the material, that everyone else would have been working on once they get on the course. And I just wondered, it sort of felt like something that it spoke to something about that sense that maybe a number of Black and ethnic minority people were feeling at that time, which is that you had to jump more hoops to kind of get into something. But I wondered what it kind of left you feeling about that process, about maybe even the Tavistock and the people that might have interviewed you.
well, there was an unfairness about it, but in my mind, I was thinking, well, I haven't done the 2 years in the way that you usually do it. I've done it in this way, I've done that. So maybe they need to be sure. So I found reasons for them doing it, but not in the way they did it,
Mhm.
right? I can understand them asking me to come back and so on. Um, but I did also think, well, yes, you're making me jump through hoops, but okay, I can do that, not a problem. And I also knew I had a place at KCC if I wanted it. So it wasn't a big deal. And I guess part of the story of going to the Tavistock was it's got the name. And if I get in there, then, that would be like a feather in my cap, right? But it taught me a really good lesson because they showed me who they were. And I know that if I got in there, I wouldn't be who I am now. Whereas with KCC, they said, okay, this is where you are. We're not going to try and change you into something else. We're going to work with you from where you are. And it was a very different experience at KCC. And I was very pleased. It wasn't easy, it was rigorous, but it was always fair.
Can I just ask, in there's a number of things there, isn't there? Because KCC again was also uh differentiate itself from the Tavistock and IFT, at that time it had its own kind of mark, didn't it, and presence. I was just wondering about your experience there of, whether you were the only Black person in that setup, um and what that was like for you. And also just in a general way, I mean, there was such an enriching kind of environment as well, with so many different people who were kind of framing the field at that time. And I wonder if you can speak about that as well. Who were the people that influenced you?
There was obviously Peter, who was he would just take anything that you say to him and he'd be curious about you in relation, got you thinking, and everyone there, even my supervisors. I remember even as I was doing my clean prac, and one of my supervisors said to me, "Oh, that was a really good session." And I thought, oh, I wonder why she's saying that. I wonder what happened. I wonder what she saw. And I asked her, and she said, "Well, you go and have a look at the tape, see what's happening, and you come and tell me." it wasn't like, here's an answer. It was, you look and see, you make some assessments, you do some judgments. And that was KCC. They actually got you to be curious about yourself and self-reflexive from day one. So I really liked the environment. As I said, it wasn't easy, but you always felt people were fair. And there was an interest in you, and you were encouraged and invited to think about what you were doing, what this meant, and so on. So for me, that was just the right place. I don't think I would have got that had I gone to the TAFE. There was another Black woman there when I joined. She had done the first 2 years. I didn't do the first 2 years because, having done the Clin Prac, I was able to go into year 3. And so I knew her, but it wasn't to say we were very different. And just like when you're joining anything new, you had to learn how to join it. So that whole thing about joining was kind of interesting, who you connected with and how. And that was, yeah, it was nice. And one of the things about KCC that I really, really liked, they brought some really interesting people over. So I learned very early on about CMM, and from Vernon Cronin and Barnett Pierce. And when people came to KCC, they talked to us, not as them up there and us down there. It was very conversational. And the whole style of KCC was much more conversational. So I learned to do that and to be more that way. And because one of the things that KCC did was they wanted us all to be a community together. So the first, the second, the third, the fourth year. And so every year, the third and fourth years had us as their audience while they showed us their learning. And that was really, really good. So going to the plenaries was really helpful. And I remember going to one plenary where there was a guy and he was getting us to think about the families we came from. He didn't use the word family scripts. I can't remember what he used, but he got us to think about our families, what they came from, what they represented, and so on. And it was at that point I realized that my parents were pioneers. And, when you do the hierarchy, the CMM hierarchy under family, I thought, pioneers. That's the identity I want to adopt. And that's how I make sense of being who I am. People might say I'm Bolshi, but I will say, as a pioneer, you had to learn to jump over obstacles or go around them or hurdle, whatever, but you had to learn or, kind of join with them in order to get where you wanted to. So obstacles are part of the landscape of a pioneer. So I began to think of myself not as Bolshi, but as a pioneer and having to face those hurdles.
And it's a really lovely reframe, of in terms of kind of that sense of trailblazing, and sort of trying different things that are very new, but also something about the territory in which you're in, and what you're kind of, in a way, walking into and what you're creating too. Uh, but I'm just wondering at the same time, when you were talking earlier about some of the challenges of being in that context, even in the KCC, um, that there was, I'm wondering where that part of Sharon that was sort of very courageous and sort of could stand up for herself and could really uh let it be known, what you want, and sort of, that people cannot kind of tell you what to do. I wonder where some of the kind of spaces were within that KCC experience where you might have had to stand up for yourself, or to kind of take that more kind of, don't know whether you call it defiance or feistiness or courage or bolshiness, whatever you would, alongside that pioneer.
Mm. Interestingly enough, I didn't experience that in KCC. They were, the KCC was much more accommodating, interested, curious. So when people asked you a question or invited something from you, they did it in a way that gave you were aware you had choices. Yeah. I I remember I was very quiet. I hardly spoke in the third year. I was so overwhelmed because I thought these people have done 2 years. I just come in, I don't know anything. I was really overwhelmed. And I had a lovely tutor, um, Alex Reed. I know he went on to Newcastle. And what he did was look at me and he said, Sharon, I can see you're being thoughtful. Um, Are there any short thoughts you want to share with us now, or do you want to wait till you're ready to share them? So, whenever you're ready, feel free. That was so like, be who you want to be, don't feel you have to. And that enabled me to be able to talk. I know lots of people look at me now and say, I can't imagine you were ever quiet. But yes, I was. And I think that helped a lot. In fact, there were tutors all the way through that were like that. I mean, I tell the story of John when I was in my fourth year because he was my tutor. And
John Shotter.
no,
Burnham.
John Burnham. John had lovely ways of getting us to work and to think. And there are so many stories I can tell about how he helped me to recognize my abilities, work with my potential, and so on. One of them being when I was, again, I would now call it irreverent, but I wouldn't have called it then. But I remember being in a session and he was with the rest of my team behind the screen. And I was talking to this woman. I remember her being dressed in white, all in white. She was, I think, Colombian or from one of the South American countries. She was very expressive and emotional. And she was very upset. And I remember thinking, I want to give her a hug. But of course, I'm a therapist. I remember having the conversation with myself. And then I thought, you know what? That's what I need to do. So I said to her, would you mind if I gave you a hug? And no sooner I said it, she was up out of her chair and gave her a hug. And I might have said a few words, and then I said, I need to go behind the screen to talk to my team. You know, all the things you do about, well, closed the curtains and stuff. And I went behind the team thinking, what's going to happen? And John looked at me and he said, what took you so long? And that was just like, it was okay. Right. And then we were able to go on and have the conversation and go back to her and talk. And I don't remember much more, but I do remember that as another occasion. And there were many occasions like that in KCC where it could have been something else, but it wasn't, because that sense of, that's where you're, tell us what you're thinking, tell us there's a meaning to you acting like that, you know, and
Where
it's
you
okay.
really bring yourself sort of and be who you wanted to be in the kind of moment.
Yeah.
Yes. So, I mean, it sounds like a very powerful kind of experience for you, very important time for you. You mentioned uh, some of the people like John, like Peter, who were really important in that sort of process. Were there, I'm curious about whether there are any women
Yes.
around, whether there are any Black women around as well, who might have had. I mean, you were talking about bell hooks earlier, but yes, I was just wondering about that experience for you.
There were other women. There were quite a few women there. There was Penny, who was one of my tutors, and certainly when I started training to be a supervisor, I was assistant to her. And she had a lovely way. And in fact, some of the exercises I then took on and used as I was training people came from what I learned with Penny. Because one of the things I think about KCC was about the theory and the practice going together. So there was her, there was Teresa, the tutor, who said, you know, this is good, and then invited me to go and look at it. There was Gabriella. There were so many different tutors that we would just sit and talk with them, and you learnt not just about them but how they did things. I remember one of our supervisors, Adriana. um, I was part of the team, and we were seeing a client, and this client was, to use the word obnoxious is not too strong. He was obnoxious both in the way he presented, in the way that he smelled, in the way that he was with the trainee therapist who was working with him. And we all felt that. And Adriana was fantastic. What she did was say to us, when the student came back, when the trainee came back into the behind the screen, she said to all of us, I want you to just have a conversation and say all the really horrible things that you're thinking that is at the top of your head. And she invited us to do that. And inviting us to do that got it all out. And then we were able to be more productive and constructive in our thinking and in our working with this client, so that then the trainee could go back and work. And I thought, I've never seen that done before, but it worked in that if she'd said you can't think that, we would immediately try and put it aside, but it would have been there informing us. But having got it out the way, we were able to think, well, okay, now what do we do? What is our task here? And so on. And that was a really good learning experience for me and a good session
Something
for
about
me.
that kind of experience that you're talking about, really being able to bring yourself, all of yourself, even the things that you might want to censor, you want to
Yeah.
come being there. And I'm just wondering, because of course you then went on at some point to develop your own training agency, and become a trainer, and uh, be a sort of a point of inspiration for people who trained with you. To say a little bit about how that came to be, the birth of Chiron.
Okay, Chiron. I had been working as a tutor at the TAVI for a number of years.
You went
With
back to the Tavi at some point in
I
between.
I got a job at the TAVI. I applied for it and got a job as a tutor at the TAVI. And I joined Jane and Vince. So there was three of us. And that was a really special time because I used to look forward to my Fridays. I gave up one day of work at the CAMS that I was working at, and I was working there one day a week. And that was really a special time because we then worked together, and we'd all come from different places. So I brought some of KCC, Vince brought some of the TAVI, Jane brought some of IFT, and together we kind of blended all these different ways of working, and worked with each other, and it was just so connected. It was lovely. But then came a time when the TAVI said, um, we're changing. We want to take this in-house. We had a lot of autonomy and so on. They knew what we were doing, but we had all of this. And I I decided, you know what, this will be a good time to leave. I was still doing the year two at IFT. So I thought, well, let me leave here. And I then took some time to take some of the structure of what I was doing at the TAVI and probably IFT. But what I wanted to do was bring in more about race and difference, because although we did it at the TAVI, we did it in a particular way. There was some space for it, but I wanted it to run through the curriculum in a way that it was talked about experience, and people could connect to it in an everyday way and look at it through the lens of CMM and so on. So that was, I guess that was part of my thinking. There were two things I think that shaped the curriculum that I did. One was the idea about just about that, but also about research. And I thought research will help me to bring race in and issues about race and difference. But it would also help me get me to help people to look critically at what they were reading, how they were applying it. So we started by doing things like I introduced book analysis. So people looked at it and specifically had to look at how it connected with social graces, how you might understand a Black parent or a Black grandparent acting in this way, located in that point in time, in that particular place, so that we then brought forward those stories. And then thinking about your agency. I know that the TAVI did an agency one, and I wanted to continue that because I thought it was important for people to look at where they were located and how the policies and practices enabled and didn't enable their work. And how it positioned them and how they challenged it and what were some of the obstacles. So I wanted people to look at that and to look at it through different lenses, including, the social graces, looking at race and so on, so that they were able to make choices and decisions or be aware of their changes, the changes and decisions they made. And then, of course, we did the research. Well, we called it practice research, but it was where they had to go and find a family to interview. And one thing the pandemic did was, because we couldn't send people out to do that, it made me think, how do we do this in a way that helped people to be much more aware of race? So I then decided we'd take film clips. So film clips where race was being played out. So I don't know, for instance, Brick Lane,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, as a film that people could look at and look at the story being told about this young girl and what it meant to live in different cultures and so on. So people got a chance to look more widely and closely at it in terms of what were they seeing, what were they observing, how were they making sense of it, and how are they going to write about it, and
Was
if
it
they were
your
going to
course?
interview.
Were you embedding this into your course?
Yeah,
So, and
yeah,
I'm just wondering, because it sounded like you decided to really center issues of race into your course.
yeah.
You were talking about how you wanted to weave it in throughout. How did that become so important for you? What were some of the sort of experiences or events or people that might have kind of uh, got you to arrive at that sort of sense
I
of
think
importance of race?
I think a lot of people I met, both black and white, really didn't know what to do when they saw a person who might have been experiencing trauma who was black. Didn't know what to do with it, didn't see it as trauma, didn't understand it, and didn't know what questions they might ask or what hypotheses they might um, create that would help them to ask questions. So part of it was thinking, what are you seeing?
Mhm.
What are you seeing? Name it. Think about it. Work with it. What does it mean? What emotions is it evoking in you? Because often, if I'm working with Black clients, and I did have that experience at KCC where a Black client came and she said, I wanted a Black therapist. And I took her on and I said to her, what was it about having a Black therapist that you felt would be important? And she said to me, when I'm talking to white people, I have to look after them. Um, there are things I can't say because it might upset them, but I thought if I had a Black therapist, then I'd be able to say some of the things I need to say and I won't be offensive. So I would do that and I would ask her questions about where it came from and so on. So it wasn't that I was letting her get away with things. And she was okay because she was looking at how to reposition herself differently, both with white people and Black people, because she was actually mixed heritage and had grown up in a white society and didn't like her Black self. So for her, it was about identity. And I recognize that identity is an issue for many people. So it was kind of helping them to look at what made it an issue. How does it show up in the work context? does it invite you to position yourself? How do you make yourself visible, invisible? And when you're visible, what happens? So it's helping people to just think about it, not have the answers, but even to go there in thinking.
So again, it's very interesting because it sort of connects me with some of our earlier conversations about how you were encountering that sense of being invisible, as a black person, and or just even a person in your own right, and the sort of thoughts that you had, the views that you had, and so and different steps along the way to really make yourself very visible, very kind of heard, and very kind of center. And here again, you're
Mm.
really wanting to make visible that part um, of you that is so obvious to so many people, but yet also quite invisible, which is about your race. So interesting that you felt that it was really important to kind of center that in your course. And I'm sort of wondering about, because you were talking about some of your professional influences and the kind of relationships that you had with people where some of these conversations were coming up. I'm sort of wondering about your more personal kind of relationships as well, and what kind of conversations might have been going on for you at that time, about you really kind of stepping uh, very much into that role as a trainer, no longer the kind of, the trainee or the novice or the person who'd come into family therapy without having done, put a couple of years of the initial training, but now really centrally as the trainer and kind of thinking about how you want to develop your own course. So who were some of the what were some of the personal conversations that were going on, and who were you having these conversations with?
There's no one in my personal life who works in this field. So there weren't conversations in my personal life about this, but lots of people in my personal life would have had my lived experience and could tell me of their lived experience of being excluded and all of those sorts of things. So I was enacting or finding ways to, if you like, make that visible. I had also joined, I mean, when I was training um, at the Tavistock, when I was a tutor at the Tavistock, there were many Black students who were failing, often the written part of the work. And I could understand from when I read that they had a lot to say, but were afraid to say it because they didn't know who was going to read it, how it was going to be judged. So talking with them about what it meant and helping them think about what stopped them from voicing things. And then I also joined Barton. So you asked where I had the conversation. I was a member of Barton, and I would go to their. We used to meet as experienced therapists. So when I say they
Like
weren't
say
family
what Barton
therapists,
is.
oh,
Sorry,
sorry,
just
Black
for
African and Asian Therapy Network. Um, and they recognized, because lots of Black people were coming to them and say, we're in these institutions that don't really understand us and they make us a problem. Um, and then we begin to think we're a problem too.
Mhm.
So that's the way it works. So we used to meet and think about the experiences and how we support each other and what meaning we gave to things and where there are other ways of thinking about it and so on. So there was all of that going on. And then Barton said to me, will you run a workshop about the writing? Because we were talking about the writing. So I said, yes, I would. So I ran a workshop, and recognizing that people, it was about, writing is about your identity, who you are and how vulnerable you feel you can be. So I started off by asking people to come along with a maybe just 500 words piece of writing about when they first knew they were Black. And some people did it. Some people couldn't do it. Some people did it long before and that spent time. Some people did it almost overnight because they had to do it. They thought they were given a task to do, so we talked about all of that in terms of how we approach our writing, what it means, what stopped us, what thoughts we had that we felt we couldn't put down, and stuff like that. So it was just helping people to, and in doing it in Barton, I then introduced it in Chiron. But of course, Chiron wasn't all Black. It was Black and white and Asian, and it was mixed. So it had a different kind of response. But the idea that people could begin to think about how their writing's bound up with who they are and who they are told they can be, who they're invited to be, and all of that was part of thinking behind that. So I had a long apprenticeship into Chiron. It didn't happen overnight.
It was are you saying that it wasn't known as Chiron at that time? It was sort of like a long gestation period, kind of before the baby was born in some way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how did you choose that name? What was it about that name that appealed to you?
Okay. That came from my love of astrology. I had hoped to be an astrological counselor, not a family therapist. In fact, even before I did social work, I started training as an astrologer. And then I realized there was no money to be made in astrology. Not at that time, and it's different now, but at that time there wasn't. So I then went on and trained as a social worker. But when I was thinking about the name for Chiron, I wanted something astrological. And I didn't want my birth sign because that was like, And then I thought of Chiron because I knew it was a planet that had been recently discovered. When I say recently, it was 1977. But it was a planet to do with health. And it was a planet to do, its ruler was Chiron, the ruler of Virgo, which is the planet to do with health and kind of analysis and so on. And it had been ruled by Mercury up to then, but they said Chiron was ruling. Chiron was a healer. So to me, Chiron, Virgo, health, and all of that made sense.
Mm, mm.
So Chiron was a mentor to some of the gods, if you know the story. He was a centaur, so he was half man and half beast, a half goat or horse, half man, half horse. And he, as I said, was a mentor. He was known as the wounded healer. He couldn't heal his wounds, but he could heal other people's.
Very fit and apt kind of name in some ways for a healing community that you were, but also something about analysis that you were talking about, and of course, Chiron has been around for a very long time, hasn't it? Has it been almost 2 decades?
How long? Chiron, as not as a training school, because Chiron I founded in 1917, 1990, 1997. Yeah, 1997.
25
Um,
years.
yeah, and it kind of grew over that time. But Chiron, the training school, didn't begin till 2011. So at that point, I started really very small with just me. And then I was joined by Kerry and Kate, who were wonderful. Kerry, Kate, and John Hills. Um, and I say they were wonderful because Chiron couldn't pay anyone anything.
It's all love, love and no money.
And that's what they did. That's what they did to get it started. So Kerry and Kate um, worked alongside me.
Mhm. I'm sort of thinking about that journey that we've been on, starting from all the way from Guyana, and we've come, and you as an 8-year-old coming into to London and landing, and the journey that you've been on, and from someone who um wasn't going well, was initially into education, and then something kind of got interrupted for a bit, and then you kind of came back into it, and then from being a trainee to a trainer, and that image of you that you've had as a pioneer. And of course, Chiron is also something that you've pioneered. And I was wondering very much about that role that you have held maybe as a pioneer in the UK context. And I'm very aware that I think it was last year, wasn't it, that you had was it like a fresh thrift almost, didn't you, at KCC? And fresh thrifts are usually given to kind of like the elders of our tribes. And I wondered what that was like for you, that experience of being honored and revered as an elder of the systemic tribe.
That was, I can't put it into words, I don't think. It was amazing. It wasn't something when it was first broached to me, I thought, I don't want this. Because yes, it makes you so visible. I'm talking to you about visible, and it makes you so visible. And I like to do my work without the visibility, and it did. But it was so, I don't know, I hadn't anticipated it would be like that. It was such an honor. I was completely overwhelmed and bowled over that people actually took the time to come and to say what they were thinking and say what I meant to them in their lives. Um, you know, it even now, I find it unbelievable. I really find it unbelievable that 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 happens. However, I will say, going to astrology,
Yes, your other
my other love,
yeah.
my other love. And it's interesting because I looked at, and I've been told this, I think, by my astrology tutor as well, about that tension between the tension in my chart between being seen and not being seen. So wanting to do as much as possible for humanity, and the kind of like the recognition for doing that, which is the Leo bit. And Leo likes to be out there, but that in my chart is kind of yes and no, yes and no. Yes, I want to be recognized. No, I don't want to be recognized. So that visibility and visibility, I think, is part of my the way my chart is structured. So given a choice, I'd say no, but it was also taken out of my hands. And it really was a wonderful thing. It was, I really, when I say I felt there was such a warmth, it was such a wonderful event to be part of for me.
I'm wondering,
Um,
it's really interesting about that journey that you've had between visibility and invisibility, and now you tell me that this is also part of your chart, your astrological kind of destiny, almost, that this is how it was going to be and is, because those themes are so present from the stories that you've been telling right from the
yes,
beginning, of that part of you that is actually is very able to make yourself visible when and actually quite powerful, and take power and take voice and sort of stand up for yourself, or let people know who you are and what you want in a very kind of uh in a very kind of confident way. It's not a forceful way. I'm thinking about the conversation that you had sorry, we were having about the interview at the Tavistock, and how you just in this very quietly confident way said, well, this is not for me to think about,
mm,
how are you going to deal with being the only one? It's for you or other students or the organization to be thinking about. And just all along, there's been a real theme of you stepping forward or kind of standing up for yourself when you've needed to be um, visible, and other times kind of going about your work and
mm.
doing things maybe in a more quieter way. And so I'm just wondering, as we're kind of coming towards the end of our time together, that culmination of that thrift, which is very visible, it is very much where you are the center stage. I wonder what it is you think the systemic community were celebrating about you.
I think in part, um, in England, at least in the UK, um, the representation of Blackness, um, and maybe that other people can, if they choose to, um, see that they can do, and they can do even more. And one of the things that I am really pleased to see is there are so many more Black family therapists, and they are doing amazing things. And I can see them growing and taking it. So, okay, I'm here, but I can see them taking things even further. And that is nice. So if me being visible means they think, yes, this can be done, then I think that's a good thing, because I would have liked to have seen, I did see, in fact, people that I could aspire to. I saw Nancy Boyd Franklin. I saw Ken Hardy. And I took from each of them, from Nancy, that way of interacting with their audience. Because when I started as a tutor at the TAVI, I thought, how am I going to do this? But I'd gone to one of her workshops and I saw. So I thought, okay, I'm going to be Nancy Boyd Franklin until I could be more me. And also Ken Hardy, loved the way he got interested. And for both of them, they don't, they show you and leave you to choose and make decisions about what you want to connect to, what works for you, what fits for you. And they are the kind of practitioners, clinicians, family therapists that I want to be like. Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, I think it's up to people what they choose. But if you don't know,
you've started talking about others when I was inviting you to talk about yourself. And I think this is one of your, this is one of your other sort of maybe gifts, which is about your humility and your modesty. Because, apart from what you're pioneering in terms of being a Black family therapist in a predominantly, as you were going through the training and then becoming a trainer, sort of much more predominantly white kind of community. My sort of sense is that, Sharon, that's not all that you've pioneered, and in the sense of being visible as a Black person, because you were saying when I was asking you that question, what do you think they were honoring? Of course, there's something about your representation, but I'm wondering if there were some other things that came up in that Festschrift that were more about you, Sharon, the person, that and your personhood, and sort of the particular relationships that people have had with you over the years that they were also honoring. And I wondered what do you think that those aspects might be of you?
because I live with me.
Of course.
That's really hard. But um what I know some people said how challenging I was in relation to them. And I think, yes, I am. But I hope, and I know from them, they didn't think I was being malicious or anything, because I think sometimes people don't see what they've got, the gifts they've got. And I see part of what I have to do is also help them see it and own it. And I think that probably came from my parents. They helped me to see who I was, not by saying you've got to be this or you've got to be that, or just by allowing me to be. And I, I just remember my dad. I can't remember the stories, but he was one to tease me if he thought I was um no, I do things and he didn't understand and he didn't tell me off. He just teased me um about it so that I could look at me
Mhm.
and see what he saw and wonder about it and think about it. He was always someone that teased me with good humor, and I could tell he was teasing. I didn't always like it. I could tell he was teasing because he he'd have this kind of twinkle in his eye and this face that wasn't a telling off face, but it was a really kind of face.
Is that sort of one of the things that you think you gave us that people could connect with, that you had this ability to challenge and provoke and sort of maybe create some space for thinking about themselves?
I like the word provoke. I hope I provoke and perturb.
Something that that you talked about that was very similar in your training at KCC, this sort of, okay, go away and think about this and sort of, come to these thoughts yourself, and what are you thinking? Mm. And just, I'm going to ask you one more question because it feels like there's so much more to talk about. But I was just thinking about that role that or that process that you've been in terms of being a pioneer, and thinking about the next generation, and I was just wondering if you were seeing the next generation of family therapists from another parallel world in 30 years' time, what would be a pleasing development for you?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's a difficult question because I think what I hope is people will feel there's this. I think one of the things that stay with me about KCC, and I hoped I brought to Chiron, was that acceptance of people and that generosity of spirit and that openness of thinking. And I hope that's something that continues because that takes everyone further. That helping people to have a sense that they belong to the wider community, they belong to themselves, they belong where they are. I mean that's I don't mean belong where you are to stay there,
Mhm.
but that sense of belonging that helps you to just go and take yourself and take others with you. That kind of acceptance, I think, because I think that's one of the things I found with KCC. I hadn't expected when I went there to be accepted in that way and given a sense that I was important.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think helping other people feel they're important um, and their lives are important and everything they do is important and relevant. That's what I hope they would be able to do.
Really, um, sort of very profound in the sense of sort of that you're hoping that the community of family therapy is going to be able to continue to help people feel like they belong and that they're special and that they are kind of accepted, and from that sort of position of kind of feeling like they belong somewhere, they can also then move and kind of move to different places, metaphorically and physically too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And the generosity of spirit that you talked about is very evident in our conversations. Thank you for your generosity in speaking with us and sharing your stories and your memories and of your development and of your passions for this
Oh,
field.
thank you. I'm going to go away and think about these questions you've been asking me, because you've asked me some questions I haven't even asked myself. And that's always a good thing for me, to be asked questions that I haven't asked myself, and just thinking about the next generation. That is such a lovely question.